Hello, my name is Jonathan Sarna, and I'm the director of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies here at Brandeis University. And it is really my great pleasure to welcome you to today's program entitled Genomic Citizenship, the Molecularization of Identity in the Contemporary Middle East. I know that's something of a mouthful, but an hour from now, everyone will understand it. Our panelists today are really two pioneering experts in this area. Professor Ian McGonigle is a former fellow of the Schusterman Summer Institute in Israel Studies, and welcome back to Brandeis, Ian. He is serving as assistant professor of global science, technology, and society in the division of sociology at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Before joining NTU, he held postdoctoral positions at Tel Aviv University, Harvard University, where he'd earlier completed his PhD, and at the University of Cambridge. Professor McGonigle has recently published a book. You can see it in the background there, entitled Genomic Citizenship, MIT Press, and it really talks about the privileged role of biology in mediating ethnic and national identities, and consequently in stabilizing national consciousness. And that's really going to be part of our discussion today. And joining him in this discussion and really serving as interlocutor is our own Professor Sara Shostak here at Brandeis University. She is Associate Professor of Sociology and Health, Science, Society, and Policy. She's a medical sociologist committed to understanding the social production of health and illness across diverse actors. And she's particularly worked on how a wide variety of different actors perceive and experience the material conditions that shape health inequality or inequities in the United States. Her famous book is Exposed Science, Genes, the Environment, and the Politics of Public Health, Population Health, sorry, and the Politics of Population Health, which has won several awards. Recently, she published Back to the Roots, Memory, Inequality, and Urban Agriculture. One note, we would love you to become involved in this discussion. Please use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. Send in questions, and in approximately 40 minutes, our Associate Director, Dr. Shana Weiss, will be moderating a question and answer with our two panelists based on your questions. Without further ado, Sara and Ian, welcome.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Thank you first for the invitation to participate in this event. It's really a treat to get to be in conversation with Professor Ian McGonigle about his new book, Genomic Citizenship. I love the background. And it's also really fun for me as a scholar who, like Professor McGonigle, is interested in genetics and science and also in collective memory and history to get to ask some questions about this book. I want to begin by saying it's a great book. All of you should find it and read it. Recognizing, however, that it hasn't been available very long, it's a brand new publication. I wanted to make sure that we spent some time this morning sort of reviewing and laying out the key findings. So I tend to think about research in terms of the empirical puzzles that it identifies and or solves. And genomic citizenship has a really great puzzle at its core. And to quote Ian now from the conclusion of the book, quote, "Despite the science falling short of unequivocally authenticating the bio-nation, the imagination of genomic citizenship persists even at the level of the state. How has this happened?" So Ian, can we begin by you telling us a little bit about how you have defined and then started to solve this really important puzzle?
Sure, absolutely. But first, just let me say thank you, Sarah, so much for taking the time to read the book, and Jonathan also for organizing the panel, and everybody at Schusterman for giving me the invitation. Before I dig into your question, Sarah, I just say it's really fun to be back with Schusterman at the book launch, because it was actually part of the Summer Institute for Israel Studies when this fieldwork began in the summer of 2015. So that was my trip to Israel when all of the fellows went on their field trip, and I stayed in Israel when everybody else went home afterwards. So that was the start of the fieldwork. So it's really great to be coming back and closing the circle, so to speak. But yeah, in terms of this question, you laid out the key contradiction that the book found, really. So thank you for that, which is that despite the fact that we hear so much about DNA these days in relation to identity, the phrase "it's in our DNA" has become such a commonplace metaphor that we almost don't think about it. And that's really the motivation for the study, to try and figure out what is it about biology that has such a powerful metaphorical potential for allowing people to imagine inclusion and maybe even the boundaries of the ethnic group or the nation. So that was the sort of curiosity that propelled me forward, that drove me to want to study genetics anthropologically. In terms of this contradiction, though, the fact that the study essentially argues that there is no clear-cut biological nation. It's not an object that's clearly defined with firm boundaries, and there's no single genetic marker that defines you as Jewish nor Qatari, at least in those contexts. That's certainly the case. So despite this scientific fact, it's surprising that states are quite often discussing the use of genetic tests to determine who might have an authentic claim on belonging to the nation. This happened in Israel in several instances, that states would be planning biological databases to catalog their citizens, that in genetic ancestry testing, people are flocking to try and understand more about their origins and their sense of identity through genetics. And this, I think, is particularly relevant to the North American context, where in recent decades, identity is more and more the object of self-construction and self-fashioning. And so in the multiracial nation like the United States, for example, genetics offers this, this window to identify ancestors with whom you can identify and construct a sense of self. So there is this contradiction between the desire, let's say the public desire, and even the desire of states to use genetics to manage populations and define the borders and control who belongs and who doesn't belong. And the fact that at the level of the lab, it's clearly not the case that it's so clear cut that you can define the nation as a biological object. So this was maybe the crucial argument and the key finding of the book. So it's great that you brought up. But the truth is, this was not the question that drove the research. Actually, this was ethnographic research, and it was, it's a little bit like following clues. And I had a clear question that I wanted to explore, but this was not the Like, it wasn't a hypothesis testing project. I knew that there was a lot of, let's say, discourse, newspaper articles, a lot of debates amongst geneticists and historians about the biological character of the Jewish nation in Israel. And I wanted to go and check that out at the level of the lab and see in what way does the nation matter at the lab bench? In what way do different ethnic identities come into play at the level of genetic research? So I kind of expected to go to the lab and to see it matter tremendously. And if you read the book, you'll see that it's much more complicated than simply nationalism configuring how genetic data are handled in Israel. And in Qatar, it's a different story entirely. So it's really a tale of two nations and how it is that the nation matters or doesn't matter in the context of genetics research.
So you've already done such a great job of laying out aspects of your research design, but I want to invite you to make that design even more explicit. As you know, we discussed in an email exchange, we imagine that there are graduate students on this webinar, and I know how important it is for graduate students to hear about how the books that they read as, you know, finished beautiful projects actually emerged. So you had this really intriguing analytic strategy, which, as you've already mentioned, it sort of hinges on a comparison of genomic projects in Israel and in Qatar. And I wondered if you could talk us through how you selected these two countries as your research sites. And maybe you could pay special attention to the really important ways in which they are similar to each other and the really important ways in which they are really different.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd like to say that it was all perfectly planned out and I knew exactly how it was going to unfold, but that's not the truth at all. I initially approached the project with a focus on Israel, and I'd started studying Hebrew and taking classes in Israel studies. And this sort of started out as an Israel-focused project. I was interested in how a multiracial nation like Israel, you know, with Jewish immigrants from all over the world that look very different and have a very different genetic profile, how it is that in the context of the Israeli state, that the very powerful sense of one nation comes to matter. So Israel was a really exciting example. And, you know, there are other facts that make it particularly a good choice for this project, which is that Jews tend to marry Jews. And so for thousands of years in the diaspora, there was relatively low levels of intermarriage. So in that sense, the different diaspora Jewish groups there was a low level of admixture with other populations. So when all of these diaspora groups came back to Israel, it created the conditions where you had this very interesting genetic mix of different populations, but nonetheless, a very, very strong sense of returning to origins and that they belong to a single nation. So I was really interested with the potential conflict of identities there between the different ethnic groups and their genetic backgrounds and the all-encompassing national identity. So I went to Israel to study that. And I was also a fellow at Tel Aviv University while I was spending a year in Israel. And I would say that was, in hindsight, that was a good idea to have a base. It's a good idea to have a base if you're doing long-term field work, and particularly in academic affiliation, because that can really connect you with local contacts. Also makes you somewhat credible. You know, being a field worker, it's very contingent and open-ended. And if you're a foreigner and you don't have a local affiliation, it's sometimes hard to figure out what you're even up to. So I had an affiliation at Tel Aviv University, which gave me a good base. And from there, I approached the National Biobank. So it's called the National Laboratory for the Genetics of Israeli Populations. And this was really the main site that I was hoping to get access to, and I was successful in getting access. But in terms of, you know, designing it and setting it up, I would say my experience in Israel on a couple of projects, not just this project, is that because Israelis tend to be quite casual and they tend not to like planning too far into the future for lots of reasons, let's say, they tend to respond well to, you know, are you free tomorrow for a meeting? So I was based in Tel Aviv University and I wrote to the head of the National Biobank and set up a meeting and introduced myself, explained that I had some background in biology, and explained a little bit about my interest. And he was very open and welcoming, and essentially took me in to the lab as a kind of a volunteer, kind of as an ethnographer, knowing that I would be watching and asking questions about what was going on. So it was, it's a little bit contingent, because you're never sure with field work that you're going to get access, particularly to, strange institutions where you don't maybe have a strong personal connection. So it was quite open-ended. After I had found such a great base in Israel, and after spending several months and figuring out what was going on the Israeli side, I was advised by some of my advisors that probably a good idea to make this a comparative project. Not only that the politics of Israel are quite sensitive in the academy, but also because comparisons are quite effective at highlighting what's important in each individual context. And so I essentially asked myself, what would be a good comparison to Israel? And Israel is a small, young, multiracial ethno-nation that's quite advanced in the biosciences. So it made sense to look for small, multiracial nations that are quite, technologically advanced in the Middle East. And at around the same time, I found out that Qatar, the Gulf Emirate of Qatar, had just established a hospital, which was the most expensive biomedical project in the world at its time. I forget the figure, several billion. And they were investing huge amounts of resources into genetics research of the ethnic population. And so this struck me as a very interesting development. And I found out that they were having a conference where they would have all of the scientists and the clinicians that were involved in the major projects there that were going to present what they were doing, which involved talking about a national genome project for the Qatari people, a national biobank where they were collecting biological samples and data on the population. So I flew out to Qatar. I actually went from Tel Aviv directly to Qatar. This involved getting a second Irish passport so that I didn't have any Israeli stamps, so that there would be no diplomatic challenges. And I went to Qatar and spent about 10 days there the first time, and really just was trying to learn as much as I could about Qatar and see what were the interesting points of comparison. And after that, I went back to Israel and realized this could be a fruitful comparison, because there's a similarity in that they're both post-British territories, let's say, with multiracial nations. Qatar is also multiracial in that it has a mix of its genetic heritage, which we can talk about also. But they're also putting, huge resources into the biosciences. But the political context is very different in Qatar. I mean, on the one hand, Qatar is an emirate, it's a monarchy. So the funding is coming directly from the emir, from the state that's funding all the biomedical research. In Israel, it's much more market-driven society, where it turns out that there's a lot more research going on in the biotech and the private arena than in the national institutions. And the demographic arrangements are not similar at all, but actually that's precisely what makes it a good comparison. So in Israel, you have a Jewish majority of about 80%, and the Israeli state is Jewish in character. And in Qatar, they have a very strong national identity, which was only intensified in previous years with the regional blockade by the other Gulf states. Mm-hmm. They also have a tremendously strong national identity, but the Qatari citizens are approximately 7 to 12% of the total population in Qatar. So you have these very different demographic arrangements. So in a sense, the national identity is configured very differently in the two countries. And so I was interested to compare how that comes to matter or not matter in the context of the biosciences and in genetics research.
And I definitely want to come back to this theme in the work about national identity. Before we move on to that, I want to pick up on something you just said very modestly, that you have some background in biology. My understanding is that you actually hold a PhD in biochemistry. And this is a unique and perspective, right, for social or cultural anthropologists to bring to ethnographic research. It meant that you were able to be a really active participant in your research site during the time that you spent in Israel. And as you just said, and as you described in the book, your data collection strategy in Qatar was a little bit different. You describe in the book that you're doing an ethnography of scientific objects, and you make a really clear distinction between doing an ethnography of scientific objects as compared to doing sort of a traditional laboratory ethnography. So I just wanted to invite you to say a little bit about what it means to do an ethnography of scientific objects. How did you define those objects? How did you, to quote Latour, follow them? And I think that it's also just really intriguing. And so I'd like to invite you also to talk a little bit about how your training as a scientist shapes how you do your research.
Thanks, Sara. Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, so I trained as a scientist and got interested in anthropology and ethnographic theory, and I wanted to sort of push myself out of my comfort zone and study in a society that was very different. So in many ways, finding myself back in the lab was sort of ethnographically disappointing. And while I was quite stimulated and exhilarated by doing fieldwork and visiting new parts of the world, in some ways, hanging around the lab was a little bit underwhelming because it was so familiar, let's say. And I had read Laboratory Life, which was the first, say, major lab ethnography that popularized, the anthropology of science. And in a way, as a trained native in the lab, it just seemed so odd for me to kind of go in and try and put on the lens and of seeing scientists in a naive way. It was not that exciting, and paying attention to my own intuition. If it's not exciting you, it's probably not going to be tremendously intellectually fruitful. So I kind of found doing ethnography the idea of doing an ethnography of the lab not that appealing. But there were bigger issues that weren't happening in the lab, which is that genetics was highly politicized. And it was highly important. And people are caring more and more about genetics. And it's coming up again and again, even in everyday encounters. So this sort of tension was what I ended up following, and which is why I described the study as a ethnography of scientific objects, because these objects, whether they exist or not as ethnic genes, whether there's actually an ethnic gene or not, it matters to many people, and it circulates as a discourse. So I make that distinction between doing a rich ethnographic account of, say, the daily life in the lab versus what I was more interested in, which is more of the discursive social life of genetics as it exceeds the science. That's, I guess, yeah.
So let's talk more about that, because I really feel like one of the most compelling aspects of the book is your really exquisite attention to the role of science, which includes but is not limited to genomics in the narratives of nation states. And you echo Benedict Anderson in writing that, to quote you, the nation needs to be imagined to be made real. And you're really interested in the ways that genomics, again, to quote the book, affords, indeed invites the imagination of the nation as a real thing. At the same time, I really appreciated your clarity, and this has already come up in our conversation this morning, about the ways that, how surprised you were to find that Jewish genes are not a focus of the scientists at Israel's National Laboratory for the Genetics of Israeli Populations. And you describe in very compelling detail the ways that the scientists at that biobank instead aspire towards a global science rather than any aspect of Jewish nationalism. So I could ask you a ton of questions about this, but just to lead off with a few, I would love to hear you reflect on what we learned from your research about the role of science, and maybe particularly the role of biobanks in nation building, because this is a very strong theme of the work. And then related, I wonder how much this story about the role of science and biobanks in nation building is specific to the contemporary Middle East, and how much this is a story about science and nation building more broadly.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. That's a really helpful question, because it helps me connect what I did in the book and what I've been doing more recently in Singapore. So yes, biobanks do matter in terms of nation building, but yeah, absolutely in different ways. So the biobank that I describe in Israel was established in the 1990s. And this was, in many ways a period of optimism, of binationalism, and, the Oslo Accords. And one of the things that I think was most important is the representation of the different ethnic groups in the biobank. So if a biobank is in the service of a dominant national identity, you would expect that the biobank would be cataloging only the dominant ethnic group. And in the case of the Israeli biobank, it was pretty much, a wide spectrum. It was precisely interested in getting as much genetic diversity as possible into the biobank and having all of the major ethnic groups included, including the various Arab, Palestinian, Druze, Bedouin populations. So that's related to the political context, and in that sense, it's very much tied into ideas and imaginations of what the nation is. So when I went to Qatar and I was interested in exploring what the Qatari Biobank was up to, first thing I found out that it was very much tied to some of their very pressing medical problems. So tribal identity is very important in the Gulf states, and marriage often occurs within cousins, second cousins or first cousins also. So this is related to the very high rate of congenital genetic disease in the population. So the state is aware of this, and they are trying to eliminate genetic disease, not necessarily by changing the marriage practices, but by using genetic screening, premarital counseling, in certain cases, in the case of IVF, they can screen out embryos that might be pathological. In any case, the biobank is very much part of treating the nation as a biological object and improving the overall health of the nation. But in terms of the demographic representations, the biobank is very much a Qatari entity, and the majority of the participants that I found were Qatari. So this is a biobank that curates and assembles the nation, even though the citizens are a minority in the territory. They become the majority, and in the sense that the biobank becomes a representational space of the nation, where there's a balance between male and females, there's a distribution across the ages, and the majority are Qatari citizens. So in this sense, it's very much a symbolic ordering device that allows a nation to be assembled as a biological object for treatment and improvement, but also symbolically that gives them this privileged space. And I've continued with this line of thought in looking at how it is that a biobank, while it might on the surface seem like an obscure tool of medicine, actually can tell you a lot about the culture and the national trajectory of the country. So I've been in Singapore for over 3 years now, and I've had a project looking at biobanks and genome projects in Singapore. And we published a paper recently on one of the biobanks here, which seems to be configured towards the national problem of aging. So this is a big problem in Asia. There's an aging population. They call it a graying of the nation. And in many ways, we found that the biobank was aiming to tackle diseases of aging, lifestyle diseases, high blood pressure, obesity, diabetes, these kinds of things. And the biobank is absolutely in the service of treating generations. So, we hear a lot about personalized medicine, or, we have national genome projects, but we found in Singapore that actually the focus is on generations and the idea of treating older generations. So all to say that the anthropological study of biobanks, I found it it's a very rich way to get a sense of what are the important underlying political and cultural dynamics, and what are the identities that are important in the contemporary context.
So I just saw we have a note in the chat from Shayna asking you to say a little bit more about what a biobank actually is. And I wonder if we can use Shayna's request as an opportunity for me also to invite you to talk about the ways that science and ethics are sort of co-produced in the process of setting up these biobanks. Because again, part of what I enjoyed and just learned a lot from the book was in reading through all that you needed to understand about ethics, law, and policy in both nations to be able to make sense of how the biobank worked.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so a biobank is simply a collection of tissues, which could be blood or any other human tissue, and also sometimes data on the population. Now, the Israeli biobank that I studied was a tissue repository. They did not collect data on the population. Many of the samples were conducted in the 1990s and 2000s, and they stopped collecting samples several years ago. This actually poses challenges because since they've stopped collecting samples, genetic technologies have advanced quite a bit, and there's now a lot more potential to do very fast and very powerful genetic analysis of those samples. But it's not always the case, and in this case, that the participants, when the IRB was drafted, there was the ethical approval to collect samples, specified that this might be done down the road. You know, it's very hard to envisage how technologies will develop, and so in many ways, this has turned into, what I describe in the book, more of a biological archive, which may or may not end up being sequenced genomically. So in that sense, it ends up with a different function. But the biobank in Qatar was established in recent years, and with tremendous support and resources. And a trip to the biobank as a donor would involve giving saliva, blood, as well as a range of physiological measurements: blood pressure, grip strength, cardiovascular output, your lung capacity. And this is a way of assessing not only the genetic background of the population, but their overall health and welfare. And these participants in the Qatar Biobank also end up getting their full genome, which is all of their DNA sequenced. And this contributes to the genome project. So biobanks do vary. It's not like there's a standard single biobank that functions the same everywhere, but the term groups together these institutions that are cataloging the nation essentially in different ways. And in terms of the issue of ethics, yeah, this matters tremendously. And I discuss it more so in the context of Qatar because they had some really interesting conversations about Islamic ethics, which I talk about in the book. So at one of the genome projects, at one of the conferences that I went to, where they spoke about the National Genome Project in Qatar, there was a speaker who talked about Islamic ethics. So they have a team of scholars trained in traditional Islamic ethics that are advising on what are the best practices for a genome project and for a biobank. So there are a range of very philosophically complicated issues that arise. So I discovered that in Islam, you don't own your body. Your body is given to you by God, and it's essentially on loan while you're alive. So you don't own your body in the normative, say, Euro-American sense of property, where it's yours to sell or do what you want with. So you can't sell your DNA, let's say, or you can't sell your blood in accordance with Islamic ethics. So this actually opens up a range of discussions that need to be had about, is it ethical to reimburse participants in the biobank for their expenses? Or is it ethical to give them compensation? Is it, does it count as a gift? Does it count as charity? A range of questions, which I find really interesting, because it's a way in which the science gets configured into more long-standing ethical practices. So this again is a way in which, I suppose, like the take-home point anthropologically and for the social study of science is that science gets indigenized in different ways. That, you know, it's quite easy to think of science as a universal practice, but actually the context really matters, and even the ethno-religious context really matters.
Yeah, I really appreciate that point, and I want to ask you to extend it a little bit. And by way of background, I'll say, you know, all of the work that I've done on genetics and genomics has been in the United States. And in the United States, there's this like truly shameful history of scientific racism that really demands that scholars studying genetics and genomics in the United States pay attention to how these forms of science have been intertwined with understandings of race and of biology that have caused profound harms to Black, Indigenous, and people of color. I'm thinking here of like really important work by scholars like Dorothy Roberts and Ruha Benjamin and Catherine Bliss, among others. In your context, the national context where you're doing this research, they're very different histories and politics that are shaping what you describe as the molecularization of ethnicity. And so I wanted to invite you to think about how this is similar to or different from the molecularization of race, and to reflect on the role of national histories and politics in shaping the course of this process of molecularization.
Yeah, that's a really important broader point about the history of eugenics. I think I would probably say to make a distinction to earlier racist projects. Let's say 20th century racism, even early 20th century racism, was a racism of appearances. Okay, people looked different. They had curly hair, or you had darker skin, or you had a certain shaped nose. People were discriminated based on outward appearances and physiological measurements. The new genetics, or the new genomics that catalogs populations, is often based on what you would call non-coding DNA, or elements of your genes that don't necessarily, but possibly have an important biological role, but probably are less important in terms of those traits that are physically manifest. So there is a transformation in forms of racial categorization. If there are concerns, or we should be worried about potential unwanted discriminatory effects of genomics, it's probably discrimination based on invisible markers, and possibly invisible markers that might be associated with disease risk, or potential medical developments that might not even be immediate, that might be down the road, and not even and with limited certainty. So from the past, discrimination might have been based on clear-cut divisions, or clear-cut categorizations. That we're entering this era where, although genomics can provide some information about your ancestry and which ethnic group you're more closely associated with, the discrimination may actually be far more diffuse and poorly defined, in the sense of, you know, are you A or B? It's probably much more statistical and nuanced. So I would say this is probably the main transformation in the role of biology and genetics in terms of potential discrimination.
I appreciate that answer. We officially have 1 minute left to this part of the program. And I want to use it to ask you a highly speculative question. If we imagine a world in which you have unlimited time and unlimited money, and we imagine that you want to use your unlimited time and money on research, Where would you go to, where would you choose as your next site to study the relationships between science, states, and the production of national imaginaries? And maybe related to that, would you continue to focus on genomics, or are there other practices, whether scientific or otherwise, that might allow you to answer that question?
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, actually, that's a really easy question for me to answer, because after I finished this project and I came to Singapore, I was awarded a pretty generous startup package, which allowed me to be very open-ended and exploratory with what the next project would be. And I mentioned that my experience in the lab was a little bit ethnographically disappointing, that I was searching, I suppose, on a personal level to experience, see the world through the eyes of a group of people that saw it very differently than I did. And I was also getting more and more interested in contemporary Israeli society and the tensions between the secular global modernity that I described in the lab and the other side of Israel, which is more the Jerusalem side of Israel than the Tel Aviv, which is more ethno-nationalist, more religious, more connected to the biblical narratives. And I wanted to find another site that had a lot to say about ethnic and national identities, but perhaps not necessarily in the context of a lab. I found out that they were doing some genetics of grapes at Ariel University, and that they were tracing the genetics of grapes to ancient indigenous grape varietals that were putatively used to make wine 2000 years ago. So this struck me as a really good connection and a possible follow-on project. If I was interested in, does human genetics have a role in authenticating and bolstering the imagination of a strong national identity? Does the science of grapes also promote the idea of an indigenous grape entailing an indigenous people in the ancient historic land of Israel? So I continued with that curiosity and made several research trips to interview the religious Jewish winemakers in the contested territories. And that ended up developing into an ethnographic film and a documentary, which I've just finished and it's on the film festival circuit at the moment. So that's what I followed up with. And it's been very fruitful. It's been very interesting. And essentially I've been following the sort of philosophical track more towards anthropology of religion, but with a focus on identity. And the element of religion that the film focuses on is actually focused on the prophecies. And you might say, what has prophecies got to do? You're talking about genetics and you're coming from biology and now you're talking about prophecies. But, the religious Jewish settlers that I interviewed, they read the prophecies, and through the texts of the prophecies, they see a very specific kind of place, which is they see the biblical landscape. And so I'm interested in how it is that in this hermeneutic process of seeing the land through the context of the biblical text, it helps establish a sense of identity, place, and rootedness. And that's not that different from the way in which geneticists or even lay practitioners read genetic code and project the importance of their ethnic identity and sense of belonging through the genetic code. So that's what I've been doing over the last few years.
I have to say, I wish we had another hour to talk about that project. That's incredibly fascinating. And I look forward to seeing the film. And if that becomes a book as well, reading the book. But I think now I need to turn things over to Dr. Shana Weiss, who will moderate the Q&A.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Sara Shostak. Thank you, Dr. Ian McGonigle, which has been a really interesting and fruitful conversation. I'll add, as a historian of Israel and in Zionism, I'll do the historian thing, which say that thing you think is new is actually really old. That's our favorite thing to do. And it's really interesting because the early Zionist thinkers struggled. They didn't use the term genetics, but they thought a lot about really what was a racial or an essentialist understanding of the Jewish nation or of Judaism, or they debated it. One famous early Zionist, Moshe Hess, right, when he speaks about Enlightenment and Jews getting civil rights in Europe and things like that. He says that may all be well and good, but the Jewish nose cannot be reformed, right? AKA you can, sort of get the civil rights and liberties in Europe, but you're always going to be a Jew in this essentialist, racialized way. So in a lot of ways, this is bringing up, I think, some of the earliest debates, at least in the Zionist context. So I wanted to start with a question from our own graduate student, Mika Hackner, who asked a great question about definitions of nation building and nationalism and how they differ between Qatar and Israel with respect to this genetic project or the biobank.
Yeah, so the nationalism in Qatar, thank you for the question, Mika. The nationalism in Qatar is a very strong sense of insidership and outsidership between the citizens and the non-citizens. It's I would say it's a very unequal society, and it's a very hierarchical society. So in that context, the biosciences, the boundaries of insidership and outsidership are even more pronounced. It's also a very religious society. So there's a very strong Islamic character to the state. So that also plays a part, as I described, in relation to the ethics. And it's also, it doesn't experience, I would say, and I describe this in the book, that it doesn't seem to have the same kinds of internal contradictions or tensions that Israel does, in the sense that Israel has an international, liberal, progressive pole in its society, which is very characteristic of places like Tel Aviv. And it also has a very ethno-nationalist, religious, primordialist strand that's much more focused on the ancient biblical past and a messianic future, which is much more of a Jerusalem perspective. So Qatar doesn't seem to have those kinds of tensions. It's both technologically advanced and globalized, but also seems to be not experiencing that tension between secularism and religious nationalism that Israel is experiencing. So these are the kinds of distinctions that I think make it important and interesting to look at how the biosciences are configured by those nationalisms. That's really what I'm drawn by, how it is that context of how the state and the national citizenry imagine themselves, how that configures the way in which the biosciences represent the nation.
Thank you. I wanted to ask about the role of religion, and you talked about this a bit with respect to Qatar, but I know that in Israel, rabbinical courts, right? So courts tasked with determining if someone is Jewish according to Jewish law, which traditionally is if the mother is Jewish or if someone converted according to Orthodox conversion, have started using DNA tests. With a lot of controversy. There has been attempts to remove or there have been legal challenges to say that the rabbinical court can't use these tests. There was a Supreme Court case last year, and a lot of the opposition is coming from the Russian-speaking community in Israel. So I was wondering if you could just speak about that. Are there any parallels of using DNA tests or genetic tests in Qatari religious courts, and how does that play out?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and you summarized it very well as to what's going on in Israel. And I would just add that there are particular protections against genetic tests in Israel, and they can only be ruled by the court under very demanding circumstances because of the taboo and the stigma of illegitimate children born out of wedlock. So the idea of identifying someone as not being their the offspring of their putative father is particularly sensitized. So for that reason, the state is quite restrictive with the use of genetic tests, and also was one of the states that passed rigorous genetic privacy laws early. And I'm aware that there are ongoing debates that on the one hand, the rabbinate are open to using genetics as another branch of analysis in their deliberations, but it's certainly not the case that they're open to, let's say, foregrounding genetics as the new definition of Jewish identity. Of course not. They're absolutely committed to the halakha and the matrilineal transmission of Jewish identity. But other scholars of this topic like Shai Levi at Van Leer Institute in Jerusalem, have argued that the Orthodox rabbinate generally have been very open to the use of genetics when it allows them to preserve their values of, purity of marital relations and reproducing Orthodox Jewish families. So it's certainly not the case of religion against science or something like that. It's far more nuanced, and generally the rabbinate in Israel is quite open to the use of science when it's within the halachic rulings and preserves what's important to them, their values, essentially. In Qatar,
we lost your sound for a second, I think. Ian, can you hear us?
You can hear me?
Now we
Yes,
can.
we can hear you
I'm
now.
here.
You went out
Sorry,
for a second.
something just popped up. Yeah, I was saying in Qatar, I have not been aware of court cases or legal debates about genetic tests. I think the challenge for Qatari society and for these institutions is kind of the opposite, which is that they're trying to build public trust and educate the Qatari population about genetics, about the importance of genetic medicine, trying to allay their fears and build trust. I know one of the challenges was about getting Qatari women to be comfortable and their families comfortable sending them to these biomedical institutions for genetic analysis and for other exams. So I think that the stigma, at least from what I could gather in Qatar, is less a stigma about genetics, but rather the challenge is to educate people about what it can offer them in terms of premarital genetic screening and all of the suffering it can help avoid, essentially.
I have this is actually a follow-up question to that, which is, it seemed like from your description that what's happening in the Qatari population with genetic testing and especially tribal marriages and cousin marriages is similar to what has been done in the Bedouin community in Israel. But there's also been attempts to have culturally sensitive genetic testing and counseling. Do you see, are there similarities? Are there any connections between these two? Is it just, how genetics work in tribal societies? If you could elaborate on that.
That's a really good question. I'm not sufficiently experienced with the Bedouin population in Israel to know about the ongoing dynamics. I know that there are the ethical committees in Israel that deal with this and advise on what are the best practices. So I can't really speak on the Bedouin population in Israel. All I would say is, in relation to Qatar, that it's dominated by the Bedouin Arab population, but that's very much part of the cultural context. Yeah, that's playing into it for sure.
Okay, I want to shift gears and think about data, right, and some of the ethics. One of the reasons that Israel, as some of you may know, was able to get vaccines so quickly is they sold the data, anonymized and done according to their ethical standards, to Pfizer, so that Pfizer could track the efficacy of the vaccines. And in general, Israel has used its healthcare system, we don't have to go into all the details now, but basically to sell sets of data relatively easily because of their centralized record keeping and whatnot. In terms of these biobanks, is medical data being sold? What are the ethical considerations of this? How does that play out differently in Qatar and Israel if it does?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's certainly the case that there's a growing valuation of genomic data. We're all becoming more aware that our data is a commodity. We need to be cautious about companies harvesting our data, and that's absolutely the case with our genomic data. There's tremendous potential for companies, if they have enough genomes from the citizens and they also have enough information about your lifestyle and your medical history, then it's probably the case that they'll be able to market direct to consumer certain therapies, perhaps years before any disease actually presents itself. So that means it's huge business, because long-term prescription sales are where the money is. Is it the case that this is happening in the biobanks I discussed in the book? No. The Israeli Biobank, it's, as I was describing earlier, it's become more of a biological archive because of the genetic privacy laws and the fact that it was established before this type of genetic sequencing was available. They're safe and protected, but there are discussions about launching new biobanks in Israel, and we'll have to see how that develops. But I would say Israel is quite sophisticated and quite progressive in terms of the ethics of genetic privacy, so it's probably in a good position, I would guess. In Qatar, they're very cautious about publishing their data on the population. It's a small population. The citizens are only a couple of 100,000, and there are, very clearly identifiable family tribal lines. So any genetic marker that could be associated with a disease and could stigmatize a particular family would be very, very troublesome. And so as a consequence, they've been very cautious about protecting the genomic data. And at one of the conferences I attended in Doha, there were debates and conversations about whether the genome projects would make the data fully available online, which has become more of a norm in genetics and in scientific research, that the data should be made available for public use when research articles are published. So they're cautious about publishing that data as well in Qatar for the same reasons, that they don't want to stigmatize identifiable populations. So it's a very apt question. This is certainly an area of growing concern. So this will be something we'll all have to pay attention to in the years to come.
And of course, there are also crime law enforcement manifestations as well, as you probably know, with the Golden State Killer and using private DNA testing to find them. Sort of final question is, I think, a more philosophical one. And, in both, let's say, the field of genetics and the history of nationalism, there's this sort of nature versus nurture. How much is the nation state something that is sort of come from the heavens, so to speak, a view that's fallen out of favor with most scholars? And for genetics, how much is, the personal experience, diseases, personality, how much of that is a result of our DNA, and how much of that is the built environment we all live in? So given that your work sits at the intersection of those two debates in really interesting ways, I was wondering if you could comment on that. And of course, Sara, if you have anything to add about that, I'd love to hear about that as well.
Yeah, sure. It's really interesting that the question is about nature and nurture, because when I attended one of the conferences in Doha, they have a theme each year. And one of the themes one year was nature and nurture. And the image for the conference was a plant, sort of weaving and growing up straight. And I thought that the symbolism was very apt, that the state was trying to produce healthy, upright citizens that would grow healthy. And actually the debates were about exactly this, how the environment plays into genetics research. In some ways, this is a question that's more about it's more about genomics in the context of let's say within the domain of genomics. This is more a question within the realm of biology. And we don't have time to go into it, and this is certainly not my area to be lecturing about. What I'm more interested in is less the question about, is it nature or nurture that constitutes how the human develops. I'm more interested in how it is that the cultural context affects how it is we understand nature in the first place, right? Our facts about nature and how we go about asking questions about nature and what is important to study and what's not important to study. I'm more interested in how the national context configures that landscape, right? So I'm less interested in, let's say, engaging in debates about the facts of biology that we know, the relative way in which they affect human development. I'm more interested in how it is that those facts themselves have political history that has interests embedded in them. And I'm interested in exploring those different interests and values and beliefs.
Yeah, I really appreciate that answer. And I would say I also am not that interested in trying to divide up what belongs in the category nature and what belongs in the category nurture, but rather in the historical construction of those categories. And in my research, I've been particularly interested in how the histories of scientific disciplines themselves and the relationships between scientific disciplines and between scientific disciplines and the state shape how scientists in those disciplines define, say, the environment, right? And tracing the shifting history of definitions of the environment over time. So I think we're answering the similar questions, just starting in different locations.
So thank you all so much for an amazing program, an amazing discussion. A recording will be sent out once it's available. Check out our upcoming events on our website, on all our social media, and we will all see you all soon. Thank you so much to everyone who helped make today possible. Thank you. Have a good day.